April 1945. The cold, gray morning of Pennsylvania greeted the first train of German women POWs as it rolled into the dusty tracks of the American camp. The train's wheels screeched against the steel rails, signaling the end of a long, grueling journey. As the heavy train doors opened, the women stepped onto American soil for the first time. Their faces were pale, their bodies exhausted from weeks of captivity and travel, but their eyes were filled with fear and confusion. They had heard rumors of what awaited them in enemy territory, tales of brutality and violence. Yet nothing could prepare them for the reality they were about to face. The camp, unlike the horror stories they had been told, was clean and orderly. The barracks were simple but well-maintained, a far cry from the crowded, unsanitary conditions they had endured in Europe. There were no signs of maltreatment, no soldiers ready to strike. Instead, they were met by American guards who, though stern, showed no signs of the cruelty they had been warned about. The women exchanged glances, unsure whether to feel relief or disbelief. They had been expecting to face something much darker. In the distance, the camp's mess hall stood, its windows reflecting the morning sun. As the women were escorted to the dining hall, their nervousness only grew. They were hungry, but the unfamiliar surroundings made them wary. What kind of food would they be served? Would it be fit for human consumption? Or were they being mocked with meager rations, as they had heard stories of other POWs being treated? They tried to brace themselves for whatever was to come, but nothing could prepare them for what lay ahead. Inside the mess hall, the smell of food hung in the air, something strange and unfamiliar. The women were handed their trays, each with a portion of soup and a small golden square of what appeared to be bread. Their eyes immediately fixed on the yellow block, unsure of what it was. Some exchanged puzzled looks, whispering amongst themselves in hushed German. The bread was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was thick, almost cake-like in its appearance, but far from what they would call bread. Greta, the unofficial leader of the group, stood at the front of the line. She picked up the square of bread and examined it with a look of disbelief. Her face twisted in mild disgust as she turned to the women behind her and said loudly, "This isn't even bread." Her voice echoed through the hall, triggering a ripple of laughter from the others. The women's mockery filled the room, loud and unrestrained. To them, the bread seemed absurd, nothing like the rye or pumpernickel they had known back home. They couldn't fathom that this strange yellow substance could be considered food. Sam Washington, the camp cook, stood at the back of the kitchen, watching them with a mixture of curiosity and hurt. He had spent the morning preparing the meal with care, thinking of it as a gesture of welcome. The cornbread was meant to be a symbol of American hospitality, something simple yet hearty, something to make the women feel at ease in a strange land. But instead, it had been met with mockery and disdain. Sam's heart sank as he observed the laughter and the dismissive remarks. His offer of kindness had been rejected in the harshest way possible. The women, too focused on their own disdain for their own unfamiliar food, failed to see the hurt in Sam's eyes. They couldn't understand the significance of the bread, a staple of survival in America, especially for the impoverished. For Sam, cornbread represented something much more than just a meal. It was a symbol of resilience, of community, and of survival. Yet, to the German women, it was nothing more than a strange, inedible joke. As the laughter continued, Sam's face grew rigid, his pride wounded. The tension in the room began to rise. The guards, who had initially greeted the women with a cautious but respectful demeanor, now exchanged uncomfortable glances. The atmosphere in the mess hall shifted from one of cautious optimism to one of silent discomfort. The women's laughter had broken something, and no one quite knew how to fix it. Sam returned to the kitchen, his movements stiff, his thoughts racing. He had prepared the cornbread with good intentions, but now it felt like a mistake. The rest of the meal passed in awkward silence. The women ate their soup without comment, their earlier laughter fading into the background. But the sting of what had just transpired lingered in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Sam went about his duties mechanically, serving the rest of the meal without his usual care. The warmth and hospitality he had hoped to offer were gone, replaced by a sense of rejection. For the first time, he questioned whether his gesture had been the right one. As the women finished their meal, they left the mess hall in silence, the echoes of their laughter still hanging over them. Greta and the others felt no remorse for their mockery. They had been hungry, tired, and overwhelmed by the strangeness of their new reality. The last thing they had expected was to be confronted with something as alien as cornbread. It felt like a symbol of everything that was different, everything they couldn't understand. It was just another reminder that they were far from home, surrounded by people whose customs were as foreign to them as their own had been to the Americans. The next morning, after the awkwardness of the previous day's meal had settled into the women's minds, a strange new tension filled the camp. The women had slept fitfully, and as they gathered in the mess hall for breakfast, they exchanged uncertain glances. None of them had expected the food to be the center of their experience in this foreign place, yet somehow it had become the focal point of their anxiety. They had expected bread and meat, something familiar, but instead they had faced mockery and confusion. As the women shuffled into the mess hall, their eyes instinctively sought the trays being distributed by the camp staff. There it was again, another portion of cornbread, golden and glistening with a slight sheen of butter. The bread from the day before still lingered in their minds, and many of them couldn't help but feel a flicker of unease at the sight. What would happen if they refused to eat it again? Would they be punished for rejecting their food? Or worse, would they be forced to eat it until they learned to like it? Greta, taking a deep breath, led the women to their usual table. She sat down slowly, her eyes momentarily darting to the golden squares. The laughter from the day before still echoed in her memory, and the weight of what they had done now rested heavily on her shoulders. She had mocked the food, the kindness behind it, and it gnawed at her conscience. She had to admit, the bread had not been as bad as she had first thought. It had been filling, even if it was strange. But how could she admit that to the others without losing her dignity? The others sat around her, their faces filled with hesitation as they picked up their trays. Some of them took the cornbread without question, while others hesitated, eyeing the yellow squares warily. They had never seen bread like this before, certainly not in the way their mothers had baked it back home. It wasn't that they were ungrateful, it was simply a matter of pride. What kind of enemy forces served this as food? Were they being humiliated? Or was it just a different way of surviving? They had been told that they were enemies of the American people, and perhaps this strange bread was part of that narrative. One woman, Lisa, tentatively picked up a piece of the cornbread and broke it in half, watching the crumbly texture fall apart in her hands. Her mouth tightened in suspicion. "It's not bread," she muttered under her breath. Greta caught her words, and for the first time she looked at the bread differently. She had dismissed it the day before, but now she was beginning to understand that maybe it wasn't meant to be compared to traditional bread at all. Maybe it wasn't supposed to be perfect. Maybe it was meant to be something simple, something that would fill their stomachs and keep them alive in a foreign land. There was an unspoken understanding among the women that they had to eat. They couldn't refuse food, no matter how strange it seemed. The reality of their captivity had begun to sink in. They were not free, and they were not in control. The bread, no matter how unappealing, was their only choice. Slowly, one by one, the women began to eat. Greta took a bite of the cornbread, and for a moment she closed her eyes, concentrating on the flavor. It was sweet, almost like cake, but with a coarse texture. It wasn't the kind of food she would have chosen, but it was filling. It had substance. And that, in the end, was what mattered most. After a few moments of silence, the women began to speak again, though it was more subdued than the previous day. "It's not terrible," Greta said quietly, breaking the silence. "It's different, but not terrible." She wasn't sure if she was trying to convince herself or the others, but her words seemed to ease some of the tension. The women exchanged looks, some of them nodding in reluctant agreement. Maybe it wasn't what they were used to, but perhaps it was something they could learn to live with. Still, the air was thick with the weight of unspoken words. They all knew that the previous day's mockery had left a mark, but none of them wanted to acknowledge it outright. They had been in captivity for so long that they couldn't afford to lose their pride, not even over something as small as food. Yet here they were, humbling themselves for the sake of survival. It was a bitter pill to swallow. As the meal progressed, there was a shift in the atmosphere. The women began to talk about other things that weren't related to food or captivity. Some discussed the weather, others spoke of memories from home, while a few began to ask questions about the camp itself. It was a small victory, a sign that they were slowly adjusting to their new lives. They were still prisoners, still enemies of the American forces, but perhaps they could find a way to coexist. Maybe, just maybe, they could learn to adapt to this strange new world. Greta looked around at the women, her gaze softening as she realized that they were all in this together. They might have laughed at the cornbread, but they were no longer laughing. Now they were quietly accepting it, finding a way to live with it. And in some strange way, it felt like a step forward. It wasn't much, but it was something. She took another bite of the cornbread, and this time it didn't seem so bad after all. It was just food, and right now that was all they needed. As the days passed, the initial awkwardness of their arrival began to fade, but the tension remained, simmering just beneath the surface. The women had started to adjust to their new routines, waking up early for roll call, attending the mandatory English lessons, and performing their duties around the camp. Yet something had shifted since that first meal with the cornbread. A subtle discomfort had settled in, a lingering unease that clung to the camp like the chill of the early spring mornings. They were learning to accept their captivity, but their pride remained intact, and every day it felt as though that pride was being tested. In the mess hall, the cornbread continued to appear. It was always there, every meal, and as the women sat down to eat, the yellow squares were impossible to ignore. Each time they saw it, they were reminded of the laughter they had shared the day before, and of how their mocking had been met with hurt. The bread, once a source of amusement, had now become a symbol of their discomfort. They couldn't help but resent it, not because it tasted bad, but because it reminded them of the way they had dismissed an offering of kindness. Greta, who had tried to act as the strong leader of the group, found herself feeling guilty every time she saw the cornbread. She had been the one to mock it the most, her words of disdain echoing in her ears as if she had betrayed something much larger than the food itself. It wasn't just the bread, it was the very act of being a prisoner, of accepting something from the hands of the enemy. She had never thought of herself as someone who would ever be in this position, but now here she was, caught between the reality of her circumstances and the need to maintain her dignity. The women, too, were struggling. They had learned to eat the cornbread, but with each passing day, it seemed like more of an obligation than a necessity. It wasn't about hunger anymore. It was about survival. And there was something degrading about having to depend on food that wasn't familiar, food that was supposed to represent the enemy. The laughter from the first meal had faded, but it had been replaced with something more dangerous, resentment. Some of the women began to avoid the cornbread altogether, pushing it aside on their plates or sharing it with others who didn't mind eating it. It wasn't just the food. The atmosphere in the camp had changed as well. At first, there had been a sense of cautious optimism, a tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, they could coexist with their American captors. But as the days wore on, the women began to feel the weight of their captivity. They were being treated with respect, yes, but they were still prisoners. The guards, who had once seemed kind and distant, now appeared cold and formal. The smiles had faded, and the daily interactions were now marked by silence and routine. There was no warmth in the air anymore, only a quiet understanding that both sides were simply going through the motions. Sam, the cook, noticed the shift in the women's behavior. He had hoped that his small gesture of kindness, offering them a taste of cornbread, would break the ice, but instead it had deepened the divide. Every time he served the bread, he could feel the tension in the room. He tried to remind himself that he was just doing his job, that the bread was a simple part of their meal, but it was hard to ignore the feeling of rejection that had followed. The laughter that had initially wounded him had now turned into an invisible wall, and every time he looked at the women, it seemed as though that wall was growing taller. As the days turned into weeks, the women began to find small ways to cope with the reality of their situation. They started forming tighter bonds with each other, huddling together during meals, sharing whispered conversations about their homes, their families, and the lives they had left behind. There was no room for laughter anymore, not after the cornbread incident. Instead, they spoke in quiet voices, their words heavy with the weight of their shared suffering. They were trying to hold on to what little dignity they had left, trying to find a way to make it through each day without letting the enemy strip them of their humanity. Greta, more than anyone, felt the pressure of this new reality. She had been the one to take charge, to lead the women through their first days in captivity, but now she felt more like a prisoner than a leader. She had to maintain control, to keep the group together. But how could she do that when everything she knew was being questioned? The cornbread had become a symbol of everything she feared, of humiliation, of losing control, of giving in to the reality of her circumstances. One evening, after dinner, as the women filed out of the mess hall, Greta stood for a moment, staring at the empty plates. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the past few days. She had hoped that the food, the cornbread, would be something they could share, something they could laugh about in the future. But instead, it had become a reminder of their captivity, a reminder that they were no longer in control of their own lives. She didn't know how to fix it, how to make things right. All she knew was that the division between them and the Americans was growing, and no matter how much she tried to bridge the gap, it felt like there was always something between them that couldn't be erased. The next day, the women gathered in their quarters, quietly discussing their feelings. They spoke of the food, of the cornbread, but more than that, they spoke of the emptiness they felt. They had no home to return to, no future to look forward to. They were stuck in this strange place with strange people, and there was nothing they could do to change it. The cornbread, in the end, had become the least of their worries. It was just another reminder of how far they had fallen, of how much they had lost. And with each passing day, that reminder became harder to ignore. The days in the camp began to blend together, each one an endless cycle of routine and quiet tension. The women had settled into the pattern of their captivity, but the feeling of discomfort still lingered, especially around mealtimes. The cornbread was no longer a topic of conversation. Instead, it had become an unspoken symbol of everything they had lost. The initial resentment had begun to fade, but it was replaced by something more insidious: regret. They couldn't help but think back to the first meal, to the laughter that had echoed through the mess hall, and they wondered if they had made a mistake. Greta was no stranger to the weight of leadership, but in these moments she felt the burden more than ever. The women looked to her for guidance, but how could she offer them answers when she herself was struggling? She had tried to be strong, to keep them focused on survival, but she was beginning to feel the cracks in her own resolve. The shame of their mockery still gnawed at her, and she couldn't shake the memory of the hurt she had seen in Sam's eyes. It was a feeling she recognized, one she had seen many times before when students, even in the classroom, dismissed her efforts without understanding. One night, as the women sat in their barracks, Greta could hear them talking in hushed tones. They spoke of their lives before the war, of their homes in Germany, and of the families they had left behind. The conversation turned to food, as it often did, and they began to talk about their mother's cooking, the warm bread, the hearty soups, the smell of fresh vegetables in the air. They spoke longingly of the comfort that food had once provided, not just as sustenance, but as a connection to their past lives. It was a fleeting moment of peace, a shared understanding of what they had lost. But it also reminded Greta of something else, the kindness they had rejected, the cornbread that had come to represent their failure to see beyond their own pride. The more she thought about it, the more Greta realized that their mockery had been a way of holding on to something familiar, something that made them feel in control, even in the face of everything they had lost. It was easier to laugh at something unfamiliar than to accept it, to acknowledge that they were no longer in a position to dictate what was right and wrong. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just about food. It was about survival, about finding a way to adapt to their new reality without losing themselves in the process. Greta's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. She looked up, startled, and opened it to find one of the women standing there. "Greta," she said softly, "we've been talking about the bread." Greta's heart skipped a beat. She had known this conversation would come eventually, but she hadn't expected it so soon. The woman continued, "We've all been thinking, maybe we were wrong. About the bread, I mean." Greta didn't know what to say at first. Her instincts told her to downplay it, to brush it off as nothing, but she could see the sincerity in the woman's eyes. It was clear that something had changed, not just in the way they viewed the bread, but in the way they saw themselves. The woman hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "We laughed at it, yes, but we also laughed because it was easier than facing the truth that we are not who we were. We are not in control anymore, and that bread, strange as it is, reminds us of that. But maybe we should be grateful for it. Maybe it's not the bread that's the problem, but the way we've been looking at it." Greta felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had feared that their pride would keep them from seeing the bigger picture, but this conversation proved otherwise. There was hope, after all, even in the most unlikely of places. The next day, during breakfast, the women sat down at their usual table, and for the first time since the cornbread incident, there was no tension in the air. There were no jokes, no mockery, just quiet acceptance. Greta looked at the bread, the yellow squares sitting on their trays, and realized that she had been wrong to dismiss it so quickly. It wasn't just food, it was a symbol of survival, of resilience, and in that moment she understood that it wasn't the bread they had to learn to accept, but the new reality they had been thrust into. The women ate their meals in silence, but this silence was different. It wasn't the uncomfortable quiet that had filled the mess hall before. This silence felt like understanding, like they were finally beginning to come to terms with their situation. They weren't just prisoners anymore. They were survivors, and they were starting to understand what it meant to survive, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. As the meal ended and the women began to rise from the table, Greta felt a sense of peace settle over her. The cornbread wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. It was enough. And in that moment, she realized that maybe that was all they really needed. To accept that things didn't have to be perfect, that survival was not about holding on to the past, but about adapting to the present. The bread, strange as it was, had become a lesson in humility, in growth, and in the quiet strength that came from learning to accept the unexpected. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was the first step toward healing. Days passed in a quiet rhythm. The women had settled into their routines, but there was something different in the air. The tension that had once felt so heavy had lifted, replaced by a growing sense of understanding. Greta, who had once carried the weight of leadership with a heavy heart, now felt a new kind of resolve. The conversation about the cornbread had sparked something within the women, a shared realization that they could not continue living in the shadow of their past. They were in a new land, facing new challenges, and it was time to stop resisting. Greta found herself reflecting on the conversation with the woman who had come to her the day before. The admission that they had laughed to cover up their fear, their helplessness, had struck a chord with her. It was true. By mocking the bread, they had been trying to assert some control over their circumstances. But what good was control in a situation where they had none? In that moment, Greta understood that the real strength came not from resisting the unknown, but from embracing it. One evening, after a long day of lessons and chores, the women gathered in their barracks, their faces tired but peaceful. It was a moment of quiet camaraderie, and the air felt warmer than it had in a long time. The guards, though still maintaining a professional distance, had started to relax around the women, and there was less formality in the air. Small gestures of kindness had begun to emerge, an offer of help with a heavy load, a shared laugh over a mispronounced word in English. The invisible walls that had once separated them were slowly crumbling. Greta watched as some of the women, who had once been so withdrawn, began to interact more freely with the guards. They still didn't speak much, but there was a new ease in the way they moved through the camp. It wasn't just the food anymore. It was the realization that survival was not just about enduring. It was about adapting, connecting, and finding strength in unlikely places. And maybe, just maybe, they had started to see the humanity in their captors as well. One morning, as the women filed into the mess hall for breakfast, something unexpected happened. Sam, the cook, entered with a tray of something new, freshly baked bread. It wasn't cornbread, but it was warm, golden, and smelled incredible. The women eyed it with curiosity, a sense of cautious optimism in the air. Sam smiled at them, his face more relaxed than they had ever seen it. "Thought you might like something a little different today," he said, his voice kind but not overly familiar. Greta took the first slice, her hands trembling slightly as she broke off a piece. She hesitated, remembering the bitterness of her past judgment, but then she took a bite. The bread was soft, slightly sweet, and comforting in a way that she hadn't expected. It was simple, humble even, but in that moment it felt like a gift not just of food, but of understanding. Sam had heard their unspoken shift, their acceptance of his cornbread, and this new bread was his way of showing them that he was willing to meet them halfway. The women began to take their slices, passing the bread around the table, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, laughter filled the mess hall again. It wasn't mocking or forced, but genuine. The tension had completely disappeared, replaced by a quiet joy in the simplicity of the moment. The bread, which had once been a symbol of their difference, had become a bridge between them and the Americans. As they ate, Greta looked around the table at the women. Some were smiling, others were simply eating in silence, but there was a shared understanding between them all. They had come a long way from the mocking laughter that had once filled the room. They had faced their fears, their pride, and their prejudices, and now they were learning to see each other and their captors in a new light. The simple act of sharing a meal had begun to change everything. That evening, after dinner, Greta found herself standing outside, staring up at the star-filled sky. She thought about the journey they had all been on,
physically, emotionally, and mentally. They had arrived in this place as prisoners, but now they were starting to feel something else. They were survivors. They had learned to adapt, to accept what was offered, and to find strength in unexpected places. Greta knew that they were still far from free, that the war had not yet ended for them. But in that moment, she felt a small, quiet sense of peace. The cornbread had been the catalyst for change, but it wasn't the bread itself that had changed them. It was what the bread had represented. It had shown them that they could survive, not just by enduring, but by embracing what came their way, no matter how strange or unfamiliar it seemed. The next morning, as the women gathered in the mess hall for breakfast, the cornbread was back on the menu. This time, however, no one laughed. No one mocked. They took their pieces with quiet acceptance, understanding that it wasn't just food. It was a symbol of their journey, of how far they had come. They had learned to see beyond the surface, to find meaning in the things that had once seemed meaningless. And that, Greta realized, was the true lesson they had learned, that sometimes the things we reject are the things that end up saving us. The bread, both cornbread and the new loaf, had become a small symbol of their resilience, of their ability to change. It wasn't about the food. It was about how they had come together, how they had faced their fears and their pride, and how they had begun to see each other as equals. It was a quiet revolution, one that had begun in the mess hall and would continue to ripple through every part of their lives. They were no longer just prisoners. They were people, learning to survive, to adapt, and to find compassion in the most unexpected of places. As the weeks passed, the cold of early spring began to give way to warmer days. But the changes in the camp were more profound than the shifting weather. The women had started to understand something important, that their survival was not just about their physical needs, but about finding a way to rebuild their sense of self. The walls of captivity still loomed over them, but within the confines of those walls, they had begun to create a space where they could breathe. They were no longer just prisoners. They were becoming a community, one small piece at a time. Greta noticed the subtle shift first. The women were talking more, not just in whispered groups, but openly, laughing and sharing stories. They had begun to teach each other English, practicing simple phrases with enthusiasm. The language barrier had been a silent wall between them and their American captors, but now it was becoming a bridge. The words were still clumsy, their accents thick, but the effort was there. They were starting to communicate in ways that transcended their roles as captors and prisoners. It was a quiet revolution, but it was happening. One day, as the women sat in their barracks, Greta noticed something else. The way they were looking at the guards had changed. There was no longer the same wariness in their eyes, no longer the sense of fear that had been so prevalent in the beginning. Instead, there was something more subtle: respect. It wasn't a complete understanding, but it was the beginning of a relationship built on mutual acknowledgement. The guards, too, had started to relax, offering small gestures of kindness, helping the women with heavy loads, or simply smiling as they passed by. These acts of decency, though small, were breaking down the barriers that had once felt insurmountable. Greta found herself reflecting on how far they had come. In the early days, it had seemed impossible to imagine a world where they could coexist with their captors. The laughter over the cornbread had been a turning point, but it had also revealed something deeper: how little they truly understood about each other. Now, as they shared meals together, as they practiced their English and tried to understand each other's worlds, there was a new kind of connection. They weren't just surviving, they were living, and that was a victory in itself. Sam Washington, the cook, had become a part of this new dynamic. He was still the one who prepared their meals, but he was no longer just a distant figure behind the kitchen doors. The women had started to interact with him more, asking him questions about his life, sharing their own stories, and laughing together over the food he made. The cornbread, once a symbol of division, had become something more, a point of connection. Sam had learned to see them not just as prisoners, but as people. And the women had learned to see him not just as a soldier, but as a human being who had his own story, his own struggles. One afternoon, as the women gathered in the mess hall for lunch, Sam surprised them. He had prepared a special meal: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and a side of cornbread, but this time the bread was different. It was soft and slightly sweet, with a texture that was familiar but with an American twist. The women eyed the food with cautious curiosity, but this time no one laughed. They had learned to appreciate the bread for what it was, a symbol of survival, a symbol of the shared human experience. As they ate, there was a new kind of ease in the room. The laughter wasn't forced anymore. It wasn't about mocking what they didn't understand, but about celebrating what they had come to know. They talked about their families back home, about the lives they had left behind, and about the lives they were trying to rebuild. The conversation flowed freely, and the silence that had once hung so heavily in the air had been replaced by a feeling of connection. The guards, too, seemed to sense the change. There were more smiles, more nods of acknowledgement as they passed by. The guards, too, seemed to sense the change. Later that evening, after the meal, Greta found herself standing outside the barracks, staring up at the sky. The stars above seemed brighter than they had in weeks, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. The camp, though still a place of captivity, had begun to feel more like a home. It wasn't perfect, but it was a place where they could find small moments of joy, where they could start to heal. The journey from mockery and division to understanding and connection had been long, but it had been worth it. Greta knew that the road ahead was still uncertain. There were many challenges yet to face, and the war had not ended for them. But in that moment, standing under the vast sky, she understood something important. Survival wasn't just about enduring the hardships. It was about finding the strength to adapt, to change, and to build something new. And maybe, just maybe, that was the greatest victory they could achieve. The next morning, as the women filed into the mess hall for breakfast, there was no tension, no unease. They took their seats, shared their greetings, and began to eat. The cornbread, now a symbol of their journey, was once again on their plates, but this time there was no mockery, no laughter. There was only quiet understanding. They had come to accept it, to accept each other, and in doing so, they had begun to heal. It was a small step, but it was a step towards something better, a future where they could find strength in each other and in the strange, unexpected kindness of their new world.